There's a moment that happens in every family tragedy, a specific second where everything changes, and the person at the center of it doesn't even know it yet. I want to tell you about a man named Marcus Chen, and I want you to hold on to that moment when it comes, because it's the difference between understanding a story and feeling it. Marcus was 70 years old in the spring of 2019. He'd spent 41 years designing and building the infrastructure that holds Atlanta together. Not the flashy stuff, the overpasses nobody thinks about when they're sitting in traffic on I-75, the structural systems underneath the Peachtree District that engineers actually study in conferences because of the complexity. He'd started a firm with a partner named Robert in 1984, grew it to 31 employees, and guided it through 2 recessions by understanding something fundamental. Structures don't survive on hope. They survive on what actually holds them up underneath. This matters because Marcus was about to learn that people don't survive on hope either. He was recovering from his 3rd week at home after a small stroke. Not a massive event, the neurologist had been very specific, almost clinical about it. A minor ischemic incident, some weakness on his left side that was already fading, speech that would be completely clear within another month or 2 with basic physical therapy. The doctor, a neurologist named Dr. Adeyemi, had used one specific phrase that I need you to remember because Marcus didn't, and it cost him everything. She said, "Marcus, you have every reason to expect a near-complete recovery." Near complete. His son David heard this. David, who was 36 years old, who worked in commercial real estate development, who had already internalized the particular pressure of being a certain kind of man in Atlanta in 2019. The kind who measures himself against other men's cars, other men's houses, other men's titles. I want to be honest about something right here, because you might be waiting for me to tell you David was always a bad person. He wasn't. David had visited his mother, Margaret, exactly 4 times in the 6 weeks she was in the hospital before she died. 4 times. His daughter, Priya, who was a night shift nurse at Emory, visited almost every single day, sometimes falling asleep in the chair beside her grandmother's bed in those scrubs before she'd even said hello to Marcus. David had noticed that, and instead of whatever feeling a person should have noticed it, David had filed it away as evidence of his daughter's poor boundaries. Even then, his mind was calculating. Even then, he was beginning to believe a story about himself that would allow him to do what he was about to do. Marcus called David from the hospital bed himself. He still had a slight slur on his left side when he spoke, words taking an extra beat to form correctly. He told his son exactly what the doctors had told him. Minor stroke, expected full recovery, a few weeks of rehabilitation, and he'd be back home on East Paces Drive, back to his golf game on Saturdays, back to life. He asked David if he could help coordinate things. David was quiet for a moment. That quiet was important. That was David calculating. Then he said, "Dad, I'll take care of it. Don't worry about anything. I'm here." In that moment, Marcus felt something release in his chest. He'd raised a son who could step up. That was the last true thing he felt for a very long time. David came to the hospital on what would be Marcus's second-to-last day as an inpatient. He came with a folder, not flowers, not a card, a medical folder, the kind you buy at any office supply store. Inside were papers, power of attorney forms, prepared by a lawyer David had apparently already consulted, dated before Marcus's stroke even happened. I need you to understand that timeline. The papers were already drawn up. David sat down in the plastic chair beside Marcus's bed and explained with the kind of calm, businesslike tone he used in meetings that it would be smart, just smart, for Marcus to sign over temporary power of attorney for health care and financial decisions. Just until he was back on his feet, just while he recovered. Marcus was still slurring his words slightly. His left side was still weak, and he thought about who he'd raised. He thought, this is what it looks like when a son takes care of his father. So he signed. He didn't call his attorney of 23 years, a man named Gerald, because David told him there wasn't time. The hospital needed it filed before discharge. He didn't know that was a lie. He had no reason to know it yet. When Marcus was discharged on a Thursday, David picked him up. Marcus expected to go home. The car turned a different direction. David explained with the same calm voice that the house had stairs, that there was a garage where Marcus had already fallen once, that it wasn't safe for a recovering stroke patient to be alone. He'd found a wonderful short-term rehabilitation facility, very highly rated, right on the north side. Marcus believed him. He was still weak, still recovering language, still carrying the gratitude of a man who believed his son was taking care of him. The facility was called Riverside Manor. It was a low brick building with a parking lot full of cracks that had never been repaired. The lobby smelled like industrial cleaner, layered over something underneath that no amount of cleaner would ever quite disguise. A woman checked him in, assigned him to room 216, told him he'd be sharing with a man named Thomas. Thomas didn't talk much, but when he did, every word counted. That was mercy, actually, though Marcus didn't know it yet. A talkative roommate would have made the next 4 months infinitely worse. But I need to stop and tell you about something I think about a lot when I think about this story. If you have ever been in a place where you didn't belong, where you were placed by circumstance and not choice, where you began to understand that the world had shifted around you while you weren't paying attention, if you have ever felt that specific kind of loneliness where you're surrounded by people but nobody is actually looking at you, nobody is actually seeing you, then you understand the first 2 weeks at Riverside Manor. Marcus threw himself into physical therapy, twice a week with a young therapist named Aisha, who told him his recovery was better than most patients half his age. His speech came back almost entirely by week 3. His left side strength returned by week 6. By early May, Dr. Adeyemi's office had confirmed in a follow-up visit that Marcus had achieved what the medical chart called functionally independent status. Functionally independent, not dependent on intensive care, not dependent on facility-based rehabilitation, ready to go home. Marcus asked David in the parking lot after that appointment when he could go home. David looked at his phone, not at his father, at his phone. Then he said he'd look into it. It was May when that conversation happened. It was August when Marcus finally understood that David had no intention of ever answering the question. By then, Thomas had explained to him, quietly one evening as Marcus stared at the water stain on the ceiling tile that looked like the shape of Georgia, that he'd seen this movie before. "You keep waiting for him to come get you," Thomas said. "He's not coming." Marcus had denied it. He'd made excuses. His son was busy. His son had just started a new position. Things would settle down. Thomas had just nodded and gone back to his crossword puzzle. Thomas had seen it happen to 4 other men in that building. 4. And now it was happening to Marcus. I want you to really sit with this for a moment. A man survives a stroke. A man's body heals exactly the way doctors said it would. A man is medically cleared to return to his life. And then that man's only son decides his life will not be returned to him. That's the kind of cruelty that requires choice. Not impulse, not desperation, choice. What Marcus found out piece by piece, mostly through paperwork Priya brought him, questions she asked on his behalf because he was locked out of his own accounts, was this. 11 days after Marcus signed that power of attorney in a hospital bed, still weak, still slurring his words, David had listed the house on East Paces Drive for sale. Not considered selling it. Listed it. The house where Marcus and Margaret had raised David. The house where Margaret died less than a year earlier. It sold in June for $547,000 to a family with young children. David used $62,000 of that to prepay 4 months at Riverside Manor, the cheapest tier they offered, a shared room. 2 men who didn't know each other, treated as units rather than people. Marcus never saw another dollar. The remaining $485,000 went into accounts he couldn't access because his son controlled every account he had. In that same month, David put a down payment on a new house in Buckhead, $180,000 down. A house with a driveway and a stone entrance and probably a feeling of finally being the right kind of man. He also financed a new Range Rover with money that traced almost exactly to the timing of the sale. Thomas didn't say "I told you so." Thomas just kept doing his crossword. Let me be honest about what Marcus went through in those months, because people often want to skip over the actual experience of exploitation and jump straight to justice. But justice doesn't mean anything if you don't understand what happened before it. Marcus sat in a shared room with a water-stained ceiling. He got up and went to physical therapy appointments he no longer needed because he was already healed. He ate meals with people who weren't his family. He watched staff members come in and out. He tried to call his son on the facility phone, and the number was no longer in service. He received no visits except from Priya, who showed up every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock like clockwork, sat on the edge of his bed, and let him talk about how confused he was, how he didn't understand where his money had gone, why David wouldn't answer his calls, why the lawyer at the front desk kept saying they'd help but never did. Priya was 25 years old and working shifts that exhausted her, and she was choosing to spend her one night off sitting in a room that smelled like bleach, with an old man trying to understand how his son could do this to him. The moment everything cracked open wasn't a moment of justice. It was a moment of clarity. Priya came to visit on a Sunday in late May. She sat on the edge of his bed instead of the chair. She asked him very quietly, "Grandpa, did Dad ever talk to you about selling the house?" Marcus told her what David had told him. The house was being kept safe, being handled while he recovered. Priya got very still. She told him she'd driven past East Pace's drive 2 days earlier on her way home from a shift. There was a moving truck in the driveway. A family he'd never seen before was carrying a couch through the front door. His front door. The dogwood tree that Margaret had planted the year David was born was still in the front yard, but somebody else's playset was already up in the back. Marcus didn't say much. He sat in that bed with the water-stained ceiling above him, and he felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold. The way a room goes cold right before a storm hits, when the air pressure drops and the birds stop making noise. Priya asked if she should call her father. Marcus said, "No, not yet." And he said something that mattered. He said, "I need to understand the whole shape of the lie before I decide what to do about it." A man who's been lied to once needs to see the entire structure before he tries to dismantle it. He'd spent 41 years designing structures. He understood load distribution, stress concentration, foundational integrity. His own life, it turned out, needed the same engineering analysis. The following week, using her own phone, because David had apparently months earlier quietly changed the contact information on file at Riverside Manor to his own cell phone, meaning any call Marcus tried to place bounced through his son, first Priya, helped Marcus reach Gerald, his longtime attorney. Gerald came to visit on a Wednesday in June. He sat across from Marcus in the little visiting room near the dining hall and listened while Marcus told him everything. Facts first, emotion afterward, the way an engineer tells a story. Gerald didn't say much while he listened. When Marcus finished, Gerald opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. "Marcus, I want you to sign a revocation of that power of attorney today. I'm filing it with Fulton County first thing tomorrow morning." Marcus asked if that was even possible given how weak he'd been when he signed the original. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus, you were functionally independent by early May, according to your own medical chart. There was no legitimate reason for that power of attorney to still be active in June. None of this was legal. All of it was choice." Marcus signed that revocation, and his hand didn't shake at all. What Gerald assembled over the following 3 weeks moved Marcus's quiet, cold feeling into something else entirely. Bank records. The house sale. The $62,000 prepayment to Riverside Manor. The $485,000 that moved directly into David's personal accounts within 8 days of closing. A down payment on the Buckhead house closed the same month. The Range Rover purchased with a check traced almost dollar for dollar to the sale proceeds. And then the thing that made it all undeniable. Emails subpoenaed later through the civil filing, where David had corresponded with a real estate agent about listing Marcus's house, 9 days before Marcus even signed the power of attorney. 9 days before. Meaning David had already decided to sell his father's house before his father had even agreed to give him the power to do it. He'd walked into that hospital room with a folder and a calm voice, and he already knew exactly what he intended to do with everything Marcus had spent 41 years building. "I need to tell you something about this specific kind of betrayal, and I need you to feel the weight of it. There are betrayals that happen in the moment, an argument that escalates, a choice made in anger, and then there are betrayals that are planned." David had sat at his desk, printed forms, consulted with a lawyer, discussed timeline with a real estate agent, all before his father even had the stroke. This wasn't desperation or pressure. This was architecture. David had built this betrayal the same way a man with a structural background designs a building. Carefully, methodically, with every load point already calculated. On the first week of July, nearly a month after Marcus had signed the revocation, though David didn't know it existed, David finally came to visit room 216. He was wearing a company golf shirt with a logo Marcus didn't recognize. The name was stitched over the left chest in white letters, Vantage Point Construction. Marcus asked what that was. David told him, almost proudly, that he'd taken a new position as a senior project manager, a huge step up, working under a CEO named Russell Cade, who'd built the company from nothing into one of the largest commercial construction outfits in the Southeast. He said this like he'd accomplished something. He said this like his father should be proud of him. Marcus filed the name away without thinking anything of it, because he had much bigger things on his mind that afternoon than David's career development. He asked his son straight out when he was coming home. David looked at his phone and said, "Dad, honestly, I think this is home now. It's what's best. You're safe here. You're being taken care of." Then Marcus asked about the house. And this is where everything that could have been misunderstood collapsed into clarity. David said, flatly, without a single flicker of shame in his voice, "I sold it. It didn't make sense to keep paying taxes and insurance on an empty place while you're here." Marcus asked where the money went. David said, "Dad, I handled it. You don't need to worry about the details. You're on your own with the day-to-day stuff now. That's just how it has to be. You're on your own." His own son said those words to him in a shared room that smelled like bleach and industrial cleaner. Then David checked his watch, said he had a meeting, and left. 3 days later, the phone number Marcus had for his son went to a recorded voice, saying the number was no longer in service. David had changed his number. His own father was sitting in a facility, medically cleared, financially destroyed, and his son changed his phone number. If you have ever felt the particular rage of powerlessness, if you have ever wanted to do something and physically couldn't, if you have ever felt the heat of injustice in your chest and had no place to put it, then you understand what Marcus did next. He did nothing. He didn't rage. He didn't throw anything. He didn't demand to see a supervisor. He told himself a story he'd learned from 41 years of engineering. Structures survive through understanding where the load concentrates, not through anger. So he told Gerald everything. He told Priya everything. And then he did the only thing that ever made sense to a man like him. He waited. He let the evidence finish assembling itself because he already knew, deep down, exactly what shape this was going to take once it was complete. He didn't know yet that the piece that would break everything open wasn't going to come from a lawyer or a bank statement. It was going to walk through the doors of Riverside Manor on a Thursday morning in late July, wearing a suit that probably cost more than everything in Marcus's closet combined, and it was going to stop dead in the hallway the second it saw his face. Riverside Manor had been trying for 2 years to get corporate sponsorship to renovate its physical therapy wing, which was frankly falling apart. 2 treadmills from the 2000s, parallel bars with peeling paint, resistance bands that staff members rationed like they were gold. In late June, the administrator announced that a local construction company had agreed to fund a full renovation as part of community outreach, and that the company's CEO would personally attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony once the work finished. Marcus heard that announcement in the dining hall and thought nothing of it. Rich men cut ribbons for tax write-offs all the time. He had no idea the company was Vantage Point Construction. He had no idea the CEO coming to cut that ribbon was the same man his son now worked under. The morning of the ceremony, the last Thursday in July, the staff wheeled and walked people into the newly finished therapy wing. Fresh paint, new equipment still wrapped in plastic, a little podium near the window. Marcus sat near the back in a folding chair that Priya had pulled up for him. She'd taken the morning off specifically to be there, and David Marcus later learned had been asked by his new employer to attend as well, representing the project management team that had overseen the renovation on the Vantage Point side. Neither of them knew the other would be there. They hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. The administrator gave a short speech. Then she introduced Russell Cade, CEO of Vantage Point Construction, a man in a gray suit, maybe 50 years old, gray at the temples. The kind of composed, easy confidence you only get from having survived something hard enough that nothing much rattles you afterward. He thanked the staff, thanked the residents for their patience during construction. And then, as he was finishing his remarks, His eyes drifted across the room the way a speaker's eyes do, sweeping the crowd out of pure habit. And they stopped on Marcus. Russell stopped mid-sentence. "Let me be very clear about what I'm telling you." This was a polished CEO giving a rehearsed speech to a room full of strangers, and he simply stopped talking. He stood there at the podium for what felt like a full 10 seconds, staring at an old man in a folding chair near the back wall. And then he said into the microphone in a voice that had gone suddenly unsteady, "I'm sorry. I need to pause for a moment." The room went quiet in that confused way. Rooms go quiet when something is happening that nobody yet understands. He stepped down from the podium, walked straight across that room, past the administrator, past the folding chairs, past David, who Marcus could see out of the corner of his eye going very pale. And Russell stopped directly in front of Marcus and said, "Marcus Yao." Not a question, a statement, like a man confirming something he could hardly believe. Marcus looked up at him, and it took a moment. 41 years is a long career. He'd mentored more young engineers than he could count by name. But then Russell said, "South Boston Avenue, 1994. You gave me a job when nobody else in this city would even let me fill out an application." And it hit Marcus like a physical thing. He had to back up to understand. In the spring of 1994, a young man named Russell Cade had walked into the offices of Yao and Partners looking for any kind of work. He was 19 years old. He'd done 14 months at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for armed robbery, a charge he'd caught at 17 when he was running with the wrong people after his mother died and his father drank himself out of the picture. No diploma. No references anyone would return a call for. A record that got him turned away from every single place he'd tried. Marcus remembers him standing in the lobby, shifting his weight, waiting to be told to leave. Robert, Marcus's partner, wanted nothing to do with it. "Liability," he said. Marcus overruled him. He put Russell on as a laborer clearing job sites, paid him $9 an hour. Within 4 months, Marcus noticed something. Russell was reading the structural drawings on his lunch breaks, teaching himself, asking questions no laborer had ever asked Marcus before. Marcus got him into a night program at Georgia Tech, co-signed a loan for his first textbooks because his credit didn't exist, wrote him a letter of recommendation on Yao and Partners' letterhead, staking his own professional reputation on a 19-year-old ex-convict. When the licensing board asked why a felon should be permitted to sit for an engineering technician certification, Marcus told them exactly what he believed. A mistake a boy makes at 17 shouldn't be a life sentence if the man he becomes proves otherwise. Russell proved otherwise 100 times over. He worked under Marcus for 6 years before he left to start his own small outfit in 2000. Marcus had lost track of him over the following 2 decades. The way you lose track of people in a busy life, though he'd heard once or twice through mutual acquaintances that Russell had built something substantial. He had no idea it was Vantage Point. He had no idea it had grown into one of the largest construction firms in the region. And he certainly had no idea, sitting in that folding chair in a shared room he'd been abandoned in by his own son, that the young man he'd vouched for 30 years earlier was about to walk back into his life at the exact moment he needed him most. Russell knelt down in front of Marcus's chair, right there in front of the whole room, in front of the administrator and the staff and the other residents and David standing frozen by the door, and he said, "Marcus, what in God's name are you doing in a place like this?" And Marcus looked at this man he hadn't seen in over 20 years. This man whose entire adult life had been built on a chance Marcus had given him when nobody else would. And Marcus said, as clearly as he could manage, "That's a long story, Russell, and you're not going to like how it ends." Russell didn't leave. He sent his driver home, canceled 2 afternoon meetings right there on his phone, and sat with Marcus in that visiting room near the dining hall for nearly 2 hours. Priya sat beside him the whole time. David did not stay. Marcus watched his own son find a reason to slip out within 10 minutes of Russell kneeling in front of him, mumbling something about a site inspection he needed to get to. And he watched Russell watch David go. And he watched something shift in Russell's face. The particular look of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. Marcus told him everything in order. Facts first, emotion afterward. The stroke. The power of attorney. Signed while he was still weak, still slurring. The house on East Paces Drive sold 11 days later for $547,000. The $62,000 prepayment to the cheapest tier at Riverside Manor, the $485,000 that disappeared into accounts he no longer had access to, the down payment on the Buckhead house, the Range Rover, the changed phone number, the words, "You're on your own." Russell didn't interrupt once. When Marcus finished, he sat back in his chair, ran a hand down his face, and said quietly, "Marcus, do you understand who you just described to me? David Yao is my newest senior project manager. I hired him myself 6 weeks ago. I have his personnel file on my desk right now." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, because for one terrible moment, he thought Russell was about to tell him he couldn't get involved, that it was a conflict, that this was between Marcus and his son, and none of his business. Instead, Russell leaned forward. He put his hand on Marcus's arm, the same steady grip Marcus remembered from a job site on South Boston Avenue 30 years earlier. And Russell said, "You gave me a job when I had a felony on my record and nothing else to my name. You put your own reputation behind mine when it cost you something to do it. I am not walking out of this room and pretending I didn't just watch a man do to his own father what nobody should ever do to anybody. Give me your attorney's number. Today, I want to pause here because this is the moment people ask me about most. I can see why. On the surface, this looks like triumph, like the cavalry arriving, like justice becoming suddenly possible. But Marcus didn't feel triumphant sitting there with Russell's hand on his arm and Priya's hand on his other one. What he felt was something quieter. Recognized. After 4 months of being handled, managed, moved, and finally discarded by the one person who was supposed to protect him, he was for the first time since that hospital bed in March, being looked at by someone who actually saw him. Not as a problem, not as a burden, as a man. That's not triumph. That's mercy. And mercy hits different. Russell called Gerald himself that same afternoon, and the two of them spoke for nearly an hour. Gerald told Marcus later it was one of the strangest and most useful phone calls of his entire career because Russell didn't just offer sympathy, he offered documentation. As David's employer, Russell had access to HR records showing the exact date David had listed his new address in Buckhead as his primary residence for payroll purposes, a date that lined up precisely with the closing on that house, 8 days after Marcus's property sold. He had records of David's company vehicle allowance being declined that same month because David had informed HR he'd financed a personal vehicle and didn't need the company car. Small things. Administrative things. But every single one another brick in a wall Gerald was building. And every single one handed over voluntarily by a man who had every professional and reputational reason to stay as far away from this mess as possible and chose instead to walk straight into it. Here's what nobody expected, and what I think even surprised Russell. Within a week, word had clearly reached David that his boss and his father were now in direct contact because David called Marcus, not the front desk. Marcus's own new cell phone, which Priya had bought him the week after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, so he'd never again be cut off from the outside world by anyone. David was angry, in a way Marcus had never heard from him before. Tight, and fast, and defensive. "Dad, what did you tell Russell? Do you understand what you're doing to my career? I just got this job." Marcus let him finish because a man who interrupts never learns the full shape of what he's dealing with. Then Marcus said, as calmly as he could manage, "Colton, I told him the truth. The same truth I'm going to tell a judge if it comes to that. You had power of attorney for 4 months. You sold my house 11 days after I signed it while I was still recovering in a hospital bed. You kept $485,000 of my money and told me I was on my own. I didn't do this to your career, son. You did this to your career the day you decided your father's life savings were yours to spend." David hung up on him. Marcus sat there holding that phone for a long time afterward. And he felt, more than anything else, tired. Not angry, tired. The way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying far longer than you should have. Gerald filed a civil suit for financial exploitation of an elderly person in the second week of August, along with a formal request that Fulton County investigate criminal charges under Georgia's elder abuse statutes. The bank records, The real estate closing documents and Russell's HR paperwork made the timeline airtight. Gerald told Marcus plainly that in cases like this, the hardest part is usually proving intent. Proving the son or daughter knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. In their case, the emails David had sent to a real estate agent 9 full days before Marcus ever signed anything. There was no ambiguity left. No room for David's lawyer once he eventually hired one to argue this had been a good-faith mistake made under pressure. But the hardest conversation of that entire summer wasn't going to be with David at all. It was going to be with Priya on a Sunday evening in late August, sitting on a little bench outside the therapy wing Russell's company had just finished renovating. When she finally told Marcus something she'd been carrying alone for weeks, she told him that back in April, before any of this had come apart, her father had asked her to stop visiting Marcus so often, told her it was enabling him, that it was confusing the boundaries of care, that the facility staff had complained Marcus was too dependent on family visits, and it was slowing his adjustment. She told him there had been 1 week in May where she'd almost listened to her father, where she'd actually considered skipping her Sunday visit because he'd made her feel guilty in that particular way. Parents can make grown children feel like she was doing something wrong by loving her grandfather too much. And then she told him why she came anyway that week and every week after. She said, "I looked at you in that bed, Grandpa, and I thought about every single Sunday call you ever answered when I was in nursing school crying about an exam I thought I'd failed. And I thought, whatever boundary Dad thinks I'm supposed to have, it isn't bigger than that." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment because he couldn't. He reached over and took her hand the way he used to take Margaret's hand and held it for a long time on that bench. And he promised himself something right then that he intended to keep for the rest of however many years he had left. He promised that the people who show up in the hard moments, the unglamorous moments, the moments when nobody's watching, those are the only people you build your life on. Those are the only ones worth building for. The civil case moved faster than Gerald expected, largely because David's own attorney, once he saw the full evidence file, advised him to settle rather than let it go to trial and risk the criminal referral moving forward alongside it. In late September, a settlement was reached. David was required to return $226,000 of the misappropriated funds, the difference accounting for legal costs and a partial offset for the $62,000 already paid toward Marcus's care. He was also required, as part of the settlement, to formally relinquish any future claim on Marcus's estate. Gerald drew up a new will the same week, not out of spite, out of clarity. David received exactly $1 a number, Gerald told Marcus some elder law attorneys used specifically so no one could later claim they'd simply forgotten by accident. Everything else went into an irrevocable trust in Priya's name, along with a separate fund, seed money of $50,000 that Marcus set up in partnership with Russell to help pay tuition and certification costs for young men and women coming out of the Georgia correction system who wanted a real trade and a real second chance. The same chance Russell got from Marcus 30 years earlier. They named it the Second Span Fund. A bridge is called a span in engineering terms. Marcus thought that fit. But Russell didn't stop at making a phone call. 2 weeks after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, once the revocation and the early stages of the civil filing were underway, he showed up at Riverside Manor on a Saturday, unannounced. No suit this time. Just a work shirt with the Vantage Point logo. He told Marcus he wasn't there as anybody's boss or anybody's CEO. He was there as a man who owed another man a debt he'd never quite figured out how to repay. He told Marcus that Riverside Manor was fine for people who genuinely needed that level of care, but that Marcus wasn't one of those people. Hadn't been since roughly 6 weeks after his stroke. And he wasn't going to let Marcus sit out the rest of this fight in a shared room with a water stain on the ceiling. He'd already looked into an independent living community called Riverside Springs over near Woodland Hills, close to where Marcus's old house used to be. Close enough that Priya's drive to see him would be 11 minutes instead of 40. He didn't offer to pay for it, he was careful about that, and Marcus respected him more for the carefulness than he would have for the gesture itself. He simply drove Marcus out there himself the following Tuesday, sat with him while he toured a bright one-bedroom unit with a small kitchen and a balcony that caught the morning sun, and waited while Marcus signed the paperwork himself with his own money once the settlement funds cleared in October. Marcus moved into Riverside Springs on the second Saturday of October. Priya helped him pack the few things he'd accumulated at Riverside Manor. And Thomas, his old roommate, shook his hand at the door and told him, with something that might have been the closest thing to a smile Marcus ever saw from him, "Told you. He wasn't coming for you, Marcus. Glad somebody finally did." Marcus gave Thomas his new number before he left. He still calls him every other Thursday. "I need to be honest about where things stand with David now, because I know some of you are waiting to hear that he showed up on Marcus's doorstep sobbing and everything got fixed. That's not what happened. That's not what real life usually does. David lost the job at Vantage Point in September. Not fired outright, Russell told Marcus later, but eased out through what the industry politely calls a mutual parting. Once the settlement became a matter of public record in the county filings, and people at the company put the pieces together. He kept the house in Buckhead. Technically, though, and this is important, the mortgage on it, combined with the settlement repayment, has put real strain on his marriage. Priya tells Marcus her mother, David's wife, calls her sometimes now, quietly on her own, still trying to understand how they got here. Marcus doesn't know what becomes of that marriage. It isn't his to fix. He stopped trying to fix things that were never his to carry in the first place. David called Marcus once more in November. A short, stiff conversation where David told him he was sorry for how things had gone, using that passive kind of language people use when they want credit for an apology without actually naming what they did. Marcus listened. He told David he appreciated the call. He told him the door wasn't locked, but that it also wasn't going to open itself, and that the next move, if there was going to be one, needed to come from David showing up, rather than explaining himself over the phone. David hasn't shown up yet. Marcus doesn't know if he will. He's made his peace with either outcome because he learned something in that shared room on Northside Drive that he doesn't think he ever fully understood before. Not even after 41 years of building things meant to last. You can love someone with everything you've got, and still not be owed their decency in return. Love doesn't purchase that. It only ever hopes for it. Priya got married this past June out at a small venue near Atlanta, and Marcus walked her down the aisle himself. His left leg fully recovered. Not even a hint of a limp left over from that morning on the ladder. Russell Cade was there too, sitting near the front, because somewhere over the last year, he stopped being Marcus's former apprentice and became something closer to the son Marcus had wished for, without either of them ever quite saying that out loud. He gave a short toast at the reception and told the room a story about a 19-year-old with a felony record and nothing to his name, and a man who looked at him and saw something worth building instead of something to be discarded. He raised his glass and said the debt he owed Marcus could never really be repaid, only passed forward, and that the Second Span Fund had already put 6 young men and women through their first year of technical certification. Marcus sat at that table with Priya's hand on his shoulder and Thomas 2 seats down because Marcus had invited him himself and hired a car to bring him. And he thought about Margaret and how much she would have loved watching her granddaughter dance in that white dress under those string lights. And he remembered something Margaret used to say, that the people who show up for you in the small, unglamorous moments are the only ones whose love you can actually build a life on. That's what Marcus has learned. That's what this whole thing taught him. I want to ask you something right now. If you've ever been in a situation where you trusted someone completely and they broke that trust, if you've ever had to decide whether anger or clarity was going to be your compass going forward, if you've ever chosen patience over rage because you understood that structures survive through engineering and not emotion, drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have signed that paper? Would you have trusted your son? I genuinely want to know because I think there's a lesson there for all of us about discernment and the difference between hope and evidence. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. Let me know if you've ever had to rebuild your life on different foundations than you expected. Marcus still drives past the house on East Paces Drive, sometimes on quiet afternoons, and looks at the dogwood tree that Margaret planted the year David was born. Still standing in that front yard, still blooming every spring for a family that has no idea what it costs to get there. He doesn't feel angry when he looks at it anymore. He mostly feels grateful in a strange and complicated way that a house can hold that much history and still keep growing something beautiful for whoever comes next. Some bridges, once the load shifts too far past what they were built to carry, simply can't be repaired. You don't grieve that forever. You learn instead which supports were actually true all along, and you build everything that matters most on those instead. And that's the story. That's the entire thing. A man spent 41 years building infrastructure. He learned the hard way that people need the same kind of careful engineering that buildings do. You don't survive on hope alone. You survive on what's actually holding you up underneath. And the people who hold you up, the ones who choose to, day after day, when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for them, those are the ones you build your life on from here forward. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself thinking about your own family, your own choices, who you're actually building for, hit subscribe. Seriously. The stories we tell matter. They shape how we see ourselves and each other. And I want to keep bringing you stories that remind you that people are more capable of both cruelty and grace than we usually admit. You deserve to see that. You deserve to understand the full shape of what people are actually capable of. So subscribe, stay with me, and I'll see you next time. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.